Today, our featured guest is Hasia Diner. I just want to mention a little bit about her background. She did her graduate work in Chicago, first at the University of Chicago, then the University of Illinois at Chicago. Before taking a faculty post at NYU, she was at University of Maryland's Department of American Studies from 1984 to 96, but then after 96, took up the named chair Paul S. and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University. From 2003, she was the director of NYU's Goldstein Goran Center for American Jewish History, and since 2017, served as interim director of NYU's Gluckman Highland House. She's the author of some 15 books, some with very inviting titles, such as Immigration and American History, Roads Taken, The Great Jewish Migrations to the New World. Her works praise her, The History of Jewish Women in America from Colonial Times to the Present, and The Lower East Side Memories, The Jewish Place in America. Major prizes, such as the Guggenheim Fellowship in 2010 and 11, for an outstanding book in American Jewish history, the Saul Wiener Prize, the Lee Max Friedman Award for Distinguished Service in the American Jewish Historical Society in 2018, and the Axon Business Book Award, Gold Medal, History and Biography in 2019. A little bit about her work. She's a prominent historian whose work has contributed significantly to our understanding of American Jewish history. She's best known for her insightful analysis of the cultural, social, and political dynamics that have shaped the Jewish experience in the United States. Her research explores themes of identity, migration, and community, shedding light on how Jewish Americans have navigated their dual identities and the broader American landscape. Related themes in her work include the dynamics of migration and diaspora, the role of community and culture in shaping experiences, and the intersection of religious and secularism in Jewish life. In probing how Jewish Americans have balanced their ethnic heritage with their American identities, she examines both the challenges and contributions they have made to the broader tapestry of American society. Diner's scholarship breaks through stereotypes, familiar they are, and offers a more refined understanding of Jewish identity, emphasizing the complexity of assimilation, community dynamics, and cultural heritage. Her voluminous published writings highlight the historical narratives that have shaped Jewish American life, thereby yielding an inclusive and accurate portrayal within the broader context of American Jewish history. Our topic today, taken from her newest book, is America's Unexpected Alliance Between the Irish and the Jews. Let me turn it over then and welcome Professor Hasia Diner to speak on her newest book.
Thank you very much, and Professor Rothfarb, and thank you to the honor to give this lecture. I am not only obliged, but very happy to say that the talk is sponsored by the Jewish Book Council, which does such an important job of bringing the public, Jewish and general, to Jewish books. And so I was honored that they asked me to be one of their speakers for this year. So without further ado, let me begin. So the history of the United States was shaped in part by the arrival of millions of Irish Catholic men and women from Ireland, starting in primarily in the 1840s and continuing well into the end of the 19th century. And the arrival later in the 19th century of about 2.5 million Jews from Europe, and coming at a time when the Irish had already planted themselves in American cities and perfected, shall we say, the art of becoming an American ethnic group. The numbers and the participation of both groups in the American labor force certainly make them alone make them an important topic, but also their involvement with politics and public education and popular culture transformed the United States in very profound ways. Upon arrival, these largely working class individuals had no choice but to come to terms with the reality that although they were capable of becoming citizens, they were without any question able to naturalize and achieve citizenship. As religious outsiders, they confronted an America that was deeply Protestant, militantly so, and an American public which defined America as its and not the province of these newcomers. So my talk and the book from which it derives asks the question, how Jewish and Irish newcomers as individuals and through the actions of the leaders of their community worked together to dislodge the nativist conceit, again, that America is ours, and in the process made the United States a more democratic and inclusive nation. Now, before getting into the details, there are a number of points I just want to emphasize. And first, what makes this Irish-Jewish connection so fascinating is that these are two people who never knew each other before coming to America. Okay, they had never met before, and without having come to the United States, they never would have encountered each other. In the United States, they met in a whole range of informal places, apartment buildings, street corners, shops, schools, and the like. The historical record is full of friendships and romance, marriages. Indeed, in the 20s and 30s, there was a slew of movies like Abby's Irish Rose and the Kellys and the Cones. And while these were fiction, they, however, spoke to, in fact, an observable reality. Now, in the drama of the meeting between the Irish and the Jews in America, while this is sponsored by the Jewish Book Council, and I see this as a profoundly Jewish book, I do give top billing to the Irish, whether immigrants or their American-born children, because for the most part, as the earlier arrivals to the United States, with their massive numbers, they truly threw the Protestant Americans into a panic, and in the process created a series of institutions and practices which grew, took hold, and then had an impact on the Jews who followed later. So they come first, and in a way, in the analysis, I'm going to give them top billing. Now, the way I am going to pose this talk and the way I have crafted the book, and again, the title is Opening Doors, the Unexpected Alliance Between the Irish and the Jews in America, makes it very clear that, and I want to emphasize that word unexpected, that the way this story has been told, certainly since the 1950s and 60s, when we begin to see the emergence of American Jewish history as a serious scholarly enterprise, that the way this story has been told was one which emphasizes the low-level violence perpetrated by Irish thugs, hoodlums, you almost always young boys on hapless Jewish victims. The story, as it's been told conventionally, this conventional narrative points to words and quotes from some Irish communal leaders about the Jews, not very nice ones, and so too on sermons delivered by Irish Catholic priests who thundered against the eternal damnation of the Jews for their role in the crucifixion. The name that immediately comes to mind is that of Fathers Charles Coughlin, the Detroit-based flamboyant radio priest who through his broadcasts reached, it was estimated, about 40 million Americans every week, bombarding the American public with a barrage of anti-Semitic words, to just pluck one of his most disgusting words out of his repertoire. The broadcast that he aired right after Kristallnacht said, "Wait till Hitler comes to America." So too, there was an Irish Catholic priest in Boston in the 1950s. Father Feeney, who preached from the soapbox in the Boston Common so often and so loudly about the Jews, or as he called them, the Sheenies, and that people knew him as Sheeny Feeney. So those stories are true. There is no question that Coughlin said what he said. There's no question that the words that historians have unearthed from the Irish press here and there certainly appeared. But instead, I want to look at a very different historical narrative. And I'm going to focus on a few aspects of this that made this, that illustrate this unexpected alliance. And so the first, I might call, and indeed the book I do, call it Defending the Jews. And so starting in the 1870s and going well into the 1930s, individual Irish community leaders stood up and defended the Jews, condemned anti-Semitism at home in their own communities, nationally, and abroad. Just to give a few highlights of this, because that's really all I could do, in 1893, at a moment when, in fact, anti-Semitism was beginning to rise in a very palpable form in America, and anti-immigrant sentiment was cresting in the form of the founding of the Immigration Restriction League. A judge in New York, Tammany Hall judge named Charles P. Daly, born in County Galway, wrote the first history of the Jews of the United States. He had been a frequent speaker at Jewish communal events. He was lionized by local Jewish community groups, known as a friend of the Jews. He was approached by a man by the name of Lewis Cowan, who is the editor of the American Hebrew. And Cowan asked Daly if he might write a book about the contribution of Jews to American life. So this County Galway judge of the New York Court of Common Pleas in 1893 published The Settlement of the Jews in North America. He was indeed the first writer to widely tell the story of the arrival of the Jews to New Amsterdam. That document just had been unearthed several years before. And in the book, Cowan, who also wrote a smaller book on the history of the Jews of New York the following year, lauded the Jews. He said, we cannot think of them as immigrants, or we cannot think of them as aliens, as newcomers. They've been here since 1654. They've been here since before the nation. They have always been civic-minded. They have always contributed to the common good, and they have always taken care of their own poor. So it was American Jewish communal leaders, Lewis Cowan, Philip Cowan, who encouraged Daly to write this book. So too, Jewish communal leaders involved in the first decade of the 20th century with the Jewish Publication Society and the American Jewish Committee turned to an Irish nationalist named Michael Davitt, who was a kind of globe-trotting journalist. Davitt went at the behest of the Hearst newspapers to cover the aftermath of the pogrom in Kishinev. He wrote a series of articles in the newspapers, and the officials of the Jewish Publication Society and the American Jewish Committee met with Davitt and asked him if he could take the articles he had written in the newspaper and transform it into a book, which was to show the American public exactly how much the Jews of the Tsarist Empire were suffering. So his book, Within the Pale, the true story of anti-Semitic persecution in Russia, became the most widely read, widely acknowledged observation of the brutality visited upon the Jews of that city in Moldavia. Davitt, again, an Irish nationalist, somebody whose life was caught up with the struggle for the Jewish people, for the Irish people, for Ireland, and for Irish independence, becomes the kind of voice of the victims of the Kishinev pogrom. So we have Daly and then Davitt. And so too, in 1924, the Knights of Columbus, a decidedly Irish Catholic organization under the leadership of its president, Edward McSweeney, concerned about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the spread of vicious xenophobia in the years after World War II, decided to commission a series of books which was to be entitled The Racial Contribution to America. So this was going to be a shelf load of books about every immigrant and minority population in the United States and what each one had contributed to the United States. The Knights of Columbus reached out to a Jewish author by the name of George Cohn, who then writes a book, which was really a kind of compliment to Charles P. Daly's, and it was entitled, The Jewish Contribution to American Civilization. And like Daly, he made a point of the Jews' contribution to America in every aspect of its life: government, literature, politics, the arts, the economy, and so much more. Now, this defense of the Jews, and I've just only given you 3 highlights, but there were many, many more. And I'm just going to add one final example of this. And so in 1936, a man by the name of Jeremiah Mahoney, Judge Jeremiah Mahoney, a judge just like Daly had been, and a very avid amateur athlete, who was by then the president of the Amateur Athletic Union, was approached by a group of Jewish athletes, and they asked Mahoney, who had his eyes on the mayoralty of New York. They asked Mahoney if he could lead the campaign within the American Olympic Commission to get the United States to boycott the Berlin Olympics. So Mahoney, at his own expense, hired an investigator to investigate the condition of the Jews in Nazi Germany in the years right before the Olympics. He brought the case to the American Olympic Commission, saying that the United States should not go to Berlin and salute Hitler. He lost. The United States did go, and Mahoney quit his job. He quit his position as head of the American Athletic Union and dropped off the American Olympic Commission. So we have a kind of, from the 1890s through the 1930s, 4 of many examples of Irish communal leaders stepping up to defend the Jews. A second area in which Jews and Irish came together, and again, with the Irish as the ones in charge, as it were, was the political machine in every large American city: New York, Chicago, Boston, Kansas City, San Francisco, and so many more, in which the Irish had come in and had learned to manipulate the ropes of city government. They were the mayors, they served on the city councils, and they controlled patronage, they controlled city contracts, and all the like. This was their power base. But by the 1880s and 1890s, they came to realize that their numbers were shrinking in comparison to the large immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and that they needed allies. And they turned to the Jews. In each one of those places, the Jews were to be their, they wanted the Jews for their vote, and they were willing to do favors for the Jews of one kind or another in order to enlist the loyalty of the Jews. Mayor Curley, James Michael Curley of Boston, the sort of consummate machine politician, once said, why it was asked, why are you always going to Jewish community events? Why are you giving so many jobs to Jewish candidates, to Jews? Why are you coming up in their defense? And he said, in this city, I'm not interested in the Italians. Okay, that was the other big immigrant group to Boston. I'm not interested in the Italians because they don't vote. I want the Jews. And so in each one of those cities, Irish political bosses and their those who worked for the machine would go to Jewish weddings and funerals, to B'nai Mitzvah, to synagogue dedications, to meetings of B'nai B'rith lodges, to Landsmannschaften, and so many others. One of the earliest Yiddish newspapers in New York, Der Wahrheit, was actually financed by Tammany Hall. Okay, now it was a Tammany Hall organ. It said good things about Tammany all the time, but it was a building block in the emergence of a Jewish print culture in the United States. So for Jews coming to the United States, meeting these Tammany Hall operatives, and again, their equivalents in so many of the other big cities was a really important moment. So here were Jews who had no citizenship in the Russian Empire, and who had never been involved in this kind of coalition politics. Here these were Jewish men come to the United States and they meet Irish politicians, and who want from them only one thing: your vote. And to get that vote, the Irish politicians did what the Jews asked them to. So indeed, one of the best sources I happened to see were the daybooks of a man by the name of Johnny Ahern, who was Tammany operative in New York. He was Manhattan Borough president, spent had a few stints in prison for corruption. And this was certainly not a good government story. But Johnny's letter books full of the letters he wrote to constituents and constituents wrote to him were full of letters from individual Jews who wanted jobs for their kids, who were having trouble with the police, who wanted this or that from Johnny Ahern. He writes one letter to the head of the New York City Parks Commission saying, my Hebrew constituents would like a special pavilion in Central Park during the days of their holiday where they cannot eat any other food. Obviously, Passover, a special pavilion where they could, food that they could eat would be available. Johnny writes a letter to the Jewish Poultry Association, the Shochtim, the chicken slaughterers of New York, saying, I'll represent you at your meeting at the Jefferson Market, and on and on. So it was in Johnny's interest to serve the Jews, the Jewish Poultry Association, the constituents who wanted a kosher food stand in Central Park, the mothers and fathers who wrote letters to get their children jobs, or the Jewish merchants who got fined for having their businesses open on a Sunday. New York had blue laws. Johnny served every one of them as well. Nearly all the Jews who move into elected office from the 1890s on were proteges of Tammany Hall, and one by one, Jews began to get elected to office in New York, Boston, Chicago, and so on. They also come to work for the machine. They get contracts on city projects through the machine and the like. So the machine served as a kind of elevator for Jews and a form of integration. Okay, Jews become integrated into the American political system through the Irish through the Irish political activists. So we have Irish communal leaders, particularly journalists and writers, defending the Jews in print, defending the Jews and arguing their case in one form or another. We have the machine politics, corrupt or not, but the machine politicians doing what they can to get the Jewish vote. And then next, a very different zone of American life, which has to do with the labor movement. So Jewish immigrants came to America after the 1870s, went to work in sweatshops and garment factories. And since they were never going back to where they had come from, they immediately began on a quest for economic security. They create several very large and powerful labor unions, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, which become major forces in fostering Jewish economic mobility, as well as the mobility of the other women and men who worked in these industries. The names of the Jewish labor leaders are a kind of American Jewish Hall of Fame, as it were. But notably, these women and men, and I'm going to talk about quite a few women as well, came to the United States with very little exposure to this kind of labor organizing. And the Bund, which had been the major, the largest Jewish labor union in Eastern Europe, didn't begin until 1897, and it was illegal in the Tsarist Empire. It only organized Jews, and it organized very few of them until well after World War I. But the Jews coming to the United States, getting involved in the labor movement, had a very different history. And it was in the labor movement, or it was in the quest for economic security through the organization of labor, that Jews encountered the Irish, who dominated American labor. So since the 1870s and 1860s, since the founding of the Knights of Labor, organized labor was organized Irish American labor. Okay, and one labor leader after another in America was either born in Ireland or the child of Irish immigrants. And they created the infrastructure for labor organizing in America. They had the expertise, they had the context, they had the know-how. So when Jews sought to organize, they turned to Irish, let's even call them teachers in the field of labor, to be able to organize themselves. So I can only offer one story of this kind, and this was the story of an individual whose name you might be familiar with, Sidney Hillman, who was a worker in the men's clothing industry in Chicago, and he was an immigrant from the Tsarist Empire, from Lithuania, and he was extremely unimpressed by the union that existed in his plant, in the factory he worked, and he wanted to create a new and more vibrant union for the workers in the men's clothing industry. He had no idea how to do that. I mean, how do you start a union? Okay, so he went to a man by the name of John Fitzpatrick. Okay, you can hear the Irish ring in that name. And Fitzpatrick gave him a great deal of support, helped him, and he said, the person who can really help you, can really give you step-by-step instructions on how to organize and how to reach out to workers, how to push the employers so that they agree to collective bargaining, go and see a woman named Agnes Nestor. So Nestor founded the Glovemakers Union. She was in Chicago, and it was a national union, but she was based in Chicago. And she was the daughter of immigrants from Ireland. Hillman goes on. He founds the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. He moves up the ranks in the CIO, and it is said that during the New Deal, whenever Roosevelt had a labor question, he would always say, "Clear it with Sidney." So here's an American Jew, an immigrant Jew, who becomes well ensconced in Roosevelt's inner circle. Well, Agnes Nestor in her memoir writes, can you believe I taught Sidney Hillman how to organize? So too on the women's side of the labor movement, Irish women and Jewish women had the highest rates of union membership of any two groups in the American public. And it was Irish women like Leonora O'Reilly and Mary Kenny O'Sullivan who took under their wing their Jewish, young Jewish women, Rose Schneiderman, Pauline Newman, and so many others, and mentored them. Rose Schneiderman, who again becomes a major figure in American labor, says that it was Leonora O'Reilly who taught her how to speak in public, how to get up and make a speech. Now, it was Schneiderman who gave the amazing speech at the memorial for the victims of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And from that speech, we get that phrase, bread and roses. And it was O'Reilly's tutelage that shaped Schneiderman as a public speaker, as an organizer, and beyond. So the women, the Irish women in the labor movement, become the teachers of the Jewish women who have arrived later, who've arrived with no exposure to labor organizing, and surely with none of those skills and none of those context that made organizing possible. So we again now have the defense of the Jews and the political machine and the labor movement, all very, very crucial parts of American life and places which serve the Jewish integration and Jewish mobility. So a final zone of American life, one which Jews themselves consider to be one of the most important aspects of their lives in America, was the realm of public education. So we know that when Jewish immigrants disembarked at Castle Garden and then at Ellis Island, their children, or most of their children, the younger of their children, went directly into American classrooms. Okay, they went to school, and it was in those schools that they learned the basic skills needed to earn a living, to be able to go beyond their parents and no longer be garment workers or the owners of rickety push carts on the street. And it was those public schools which became the great engine of American Jewish integration and mobility. And notably, when they went into those classrooms, they met a particular group of Americans, the teachers, nearly all of whom were Irish American women. So New York, Chicago, Boston, even San Francisco, since I know I'm talking to people in California, had a huge teaching force made up of the daughters of Irish immigrants, women whose mothers had probably been domestic servants and fathers unskilled laborers. The next generation of women flooded into the American classrooms as teachers. So these women in the classrooms, these legions of Irish American teachers were the guides to their Jewish pupils on the details of American culture. They taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, and beyond. Now, notably, many of these children, most of these children had parents who didn't speak English. Okay, and were themselves struggling to learn. And it was the teachers who gave them that tool. These teachers became the bearers of American culture. They gave the children models of how does an American sound? What's an American accent? New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Philadelphia, and so on, different accents. But what does an American sound like? What is correct grammar? How does an American dress? What does their hair look like? These became the standard bearers of the American way. These teachers led the children in the Pledge of Allegiance, led them in the singing of patriotic songs, taught them about American holidays, and prepared them to enter the middle class. They were key players in the project of Jewish immigrant integration. The great book by Irving Howe, World of Our Fathers, makes the point. He did a vast amount of reading in memoirs, as did I. And he says, he puts it very succinctly. I'll use his words. He said, I read, hundreds of memoirs of American Jews, Jews who were immigrants, came as children and went to public schools, or the children of immigrants. And he said there must have been a bigot or two among these teachers, but you don't find that in the memoirs. And they talked about these women as opening doors for them, okay, as sympathetic, uh, very strict teachers about behavior and cleanliness and grammar and doing the homework, but he said not a bigot among them. Now, we know a lot about these teachers. We know a lot about these teachers from all sorts of sources, but one notably was a woman named Myra Kelly, who came to New York from Dublin. Her father was actually a physician on the Lower East Side and had a medical practice almost completely of Jewish immigrants. She became a teacher, and then she moved on to becoming a novelist and a short story writer. And she has a whole series of books about her protagonist, Miss Bailey, and the Jewish children who were her students. They're delightful books called Little Citizens, Little Aliens, Wards of Liberty, but they tell a story. Okay, romanticized, no doubt, because it's fiction, but yet tell a story of children and their parents who turn to these teachers, and the teachers who see it as a duty of theirs to teach these children well. So the public school classrooms became a site of this unexpected alliance between the Jews and the Irish. In the category of education, and I'm going to be drawing this to a close relatively soon, in the category of education, we might want to look at I wanted to look at one more way in which the Irish were the teachers of the Jews. So starting in the 1920s, when many American colleges and universities and schools of professional education, that is law, medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, business, and the like, began to put up erect quotas against Jewish students, against Jewish applicants. Okay, and indeed, some cases just wouldn't take them at all. The Catholic universities stepped in and opened their doors to Jewish students, but some at the undergraduate level, but mostly in the professional schools. Notably, just as a little anecdote, in 1922, when Harvard instituted its quota against on Jewish students, limiting the number of Jewish students who could enter any freshman class at 10%, Loyola of Chicago, okay, school with Irish Catholic founders, Irish Catholic trustees, Irish Catholic administrators, many of the faculty were Irish Catholic priests. Loyola of Chicago put an ad in the Jewish newspapers of Chicago saying, apply to Loyola, okay? And essentially saying, we're not Harvard, okay? We don't have quotas on Jewish students. So most of these students, so these schools, for these schools, the admission of Jewish students, which began to blossom in the 19-teens and then went on into the 20s, became a really powerful place or setting in which Jews could gain the tools and the credentials to enter into the middle class. Okay, now the schools may have done this for a range of reasons. They may have done it to say, we're better than those Protestant or Protestant-tinged institutions which discriminate against Jews. We're not like that. We're more liberal and open-minded than they are. Likewise, they may have done it because they really believed that school education should not be limited only to their own people. They may have also done it because here we're going to be tuition paying students, pure and simple. The students may do well, and once they graduated, they could become loyal donors and supporters of the school. So Louis Lefkowitz, who was the long-serving Attorney General of the state of New York, as a young man had attended Fordham Law School. Okay, Irish founded. In fact, it was the oldest Irish founded. That Irish Catholic board of trustees, administrators, and the like. But Lefkowitz went to Fordham, and he attended the law school there. And he remained a lifelong supporter of the school. Was a major fundraiser for Fordham. So too Henry Monsky, who went on to become the president of the B'nai B'rith, and again, a very important figure in global Jewish politics in the aftermath of World War II. Well, Henry Monsky went to Creighton, again, an Irish-founded school in Omaha, Nebraska, and he went to the law school and was a major supporter of Creighton for the rest of his life. And he said, I owe to Creighton my education and my chance to get into the legal profession. So to just give you a little flavor of this, or just a little sense, even let's call it statistics, by the 1930s, Fordham's law school was half Jewish, as was that of St. John's in Brooklyn. Okay, both Fordham and St. John's had pharmacy schools, which were a majority Jewish. Okay, and indeed, Fordham's pharmacy school had a Jewish dean, so he was the only Jewish dean of a pharmacy school any place in the United States. And when an official, so Fordham was under Jesuit auspices, and so when an official of the Jesuit order came to New York to do an inspection of Fordham, and he saw that there was a Jewish dean of one of the schools, he demanded that the president fire him. He said, you can't have a Jewish dean in a Jesuit institution. And the president of Fordham said, he's the best dean we have. We are not firing him. So in those schools, as in so many others of these Catholic universities, Jewish men and some women got a chance to acquire the kind of educations and the credentials that allowed them to become doctors and lawyers and pharmacists and more. Now, beyond the realm of the obvious as to why the Catholic schools began with real vigor in the 1920s to open their doors to Jews, we should remember that the 1920s was the decade of the Ku Klux Klan, which was an equal opportunity hater of both Jews and Catholics, obviously African Americans as well. The 1920s was a decade of kind of high point of xenophobia, of anti-Catholicism. And just to refresh perhaps from an old course you took in US history in 1928, Al Smith, the first Catholic to run for the presidency, was handily defeated, and much of the campaign rhetoric against Smith was, you can't have a Catholic in the White House. So anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism were rife in the 20s. And so for the Catholic professional schools and the boards of trustees and the administrators who ran them, they declared by virtue of their admissions policies that they did not share in the prejudices which prevailed around the United States. By doing this, they made a moral statement announcing that as Catholics, and frankly, as Irish people, and they were quite open about this, they didn't share in the hatred of Jews that was seizing the nation. Their own history of persecution in the past and their experiences in the present at the hands of Protestant xenophobia impelled them to admit Jews and to integrate these students into their student bodies. Now, this is not to say that at those schools there weren't anti-Semites, but from the record as it exists, no untoward incidents took place. The Jewish students looked back fondly at their years at St. John's and Boston College and Fordham and Georgetown and Creighton and the University and Providence College and so many others. So I'm going to bring this to a close so we can do some questions and answers. But basically, in all these ways, the defense of the Jews, public education, the labor movement, the political machine, the Catholic universities, in all these ways in places of allyship, of Jews and Irish being allies to the other, both saw that they were going to get something out of this relationship. The Jews saw they were going to benefit from these Irish door openers. Okay, what they saw as these powerful Americans who could open doors for them. And from the point of view of the Irish, it shored up their own status in America to present themselves sincerely as more liberal, less bigoted than those Americans who claimed that the Irish Catholics had no place in American society. The two of them helped each other. It was self-interest. And in this way, they helped make the United States a more inclusive and democratic nation. So I'm going to end with that, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you, Professor Diner, for such a stimulating talk, revealing so many things I had no idea about. I imagine there are going to be some questions here, so let me open it up. I neglected to say at the beginning that those in attendance could post questions at any time, but they can certainly do it now. So let me call for some questions. You type in the question answer box, which you can open up from the bottom of the screen. Not seeing anything so far. Richard, I think you had a few questions, but you're on mute. Okay, here's one. Can you tell us anything about the way these Irish Catholic teachers were educated to become accepting of Jewish immigrants?
Okay, I mean, that's a great question. So for one thing, they were educated primarily in normal schools. So there was very different kind of training for teachers than we would have now. And so they were trained in normal schools. And there was no specific curriculum or no specific kind of lesson for them on the students they were going to meet in the schools that they were going to teach. They were educated in these normal schools to learn very basic, how to teach reading, how to teach math, how to teach social studies, and the like. And it was, in a way, it's something it's really hard to use the following word, but it just seems instinctive that these were their students. To them, teaching was an incredibly honorable occupation. No, I'm going to say that over. Teaching was an incredibly honorable profession, not occupation. It was an incredible leap upward for them, and they were really grateful for the job to be able to be teachers. And so interactions with the students was a reflection of their, I think, the value they placed on being teachers and the sanctity of that work.
Okay, I think we have a second question. Was there a connection between these teachers and the settlement house movement?
Okay, that's a great question. And so, not really. I mean, the settlement houses were, and they were also very important in Jewish life and in fostering Jewish education. But most of the settlement house workers were Protestant. Okay, if not, if the settlements house, some of them were Protestant, indeed Protestant. Most of them were not. They were non-sectarian, but the settlement workers themselves came out of Protestant background. And if anything, many of the settlement workers who were associated with American progressivism and reform politics tended to really look down on the Irish. They were they saw the Irish as actually a really negative force in American life. And so, for example, until the 19 teens and 20s, in many of these cities, teachers got their jobs through the political machine. That's one reason Irish women were able to get these jobs. So their dads had connection to the machine. So they would talk to a machine politician, the ward captain, whoever, and say, look, my daughter is going to normal school. Can you get her a job? And so to the settlement house workers, this was a matter of corruption. And the settlement house workers were very closely associated with efforts to reform education and to make education, the pipeline to jobs come through the civil service and not through the machine. So now again, the story of Jews and the settlement houses is a fascinating one, but it's a very different cast of characters.
I have a question. What were the consequences, if any, of those Irish Catholics who came forward in defense of or in help to the Jews?
The consequences, well, if they were coming out of the political system, they got the Jews' vote. And so that's not unimportant to them. I think they felt that it was, again, making it at a time when most Protestant Americans viewed Catholics in general, the Irish in particular, as inferior, as bigoted, as people who had no place in a democratic, forward-looking, modern nation. For them to come out as the supporters of the Jews was a kind of in your face to the Protestants, who they said were the perpetrators of much of this bigotry. And somebody I didn't talk about, John Boyle O'Reilly, who was the editor of the Boston Pilot, which was the Catholic newspaper in Boston, took such glee every time he saw an act of anti-Semitism on the part of one of the Protestant elites of Boston, the Henry Adams types. Anything that happened at Harvard that was smacked of anti-Semitism, O'Reilly used the columns of the Pilot to say, look, these people think they're better than us, and they're the ones who are treating the Jews badly. We're the ones who are defending them. So it helped them prove their own modern liberal bona fides. And so you can be a Catholic and still be a liberal American.
Why weren't the Italian immigrants more helpful to Jews?
Okay, because the Italian, it's a great question. And I have always wanted a student to write one of my dissertation students to do a history of the Jewish-Italian encounter in America. The Italians come at the same time as the Jews. In fact, their migration begins in real earnest in the 1890s. So at least a decade and a half after the large-scale East European Jewish immigration began. So the Italians controlled nothing that the Jews needed. They themselves had no power base in the United States. They had very low rates because they came later. They had not established anything that could serve the Jews. They didn't control any labor unions. They had no political clout at all. They're Jews elected to, for example, the Boston City Council before there were Italians elected to the Boston City Council. Italians had very high rates of return migration. They had relatively low rates of naturalization and acquisition of citizenship. And so they were just in no place to help. And if anything, in the labor movement, once the Jews create, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, they actually become mentors to the Italians, who again did not have that sort of 40 years on the Jews, which the Irish did.
Hang on.
Oh, I see. Okay. I see.
Despite the great differences between the first half of the 20th century and our time, might you be willing to think about how our current problems with immigrants and immigration, at least from the current occupant in the White House, what might happen to us at the present?
Well, what might happen to us in the present, I dread every morning when I go to pick up my newspaper. And I can't say anything about current occupant, but I obviously made it pretty clear what I just said. I mean, I think the anti-immigrant sentiment that's roiling the nation now is absolutely no different than the anti-immigration sentiment which roiled the nation. I mean, from the point of view of the talk I gave, from the 1890s on. And earlier in the 1850s, anti-immigrant meant anti-Catholic and anti-Irish. And the one of the most successful third parties in American history were the Know Nothings. They were anti-Catholic. That was their platform. And the arguments made against immigrants are the same in the 1850s and the 1890s and the 1920s and now, all of which were untrue. Okay, that there was something wrong with these people, that they were inferior, that they would never become American, they'd never learn English. And that was said, by the way, about many of the Jews. They're never going to learn English, and that they took jobs away from Americans. It was never true then. It isn't true now. And in each case, the nativists, okay, I guess including the current occupant, riled up the public on the idea of, they're trying to replace us. America is ours. We made it, we created it, we get to dominate it. It's ours, and they don't have any place here because they are going to outnumber us, and we have to be careful. Okay, and Theodore Roosevelt, he was actually quite a friend of the Jews. He used to go around the country. He was very anti-immigrant, and he used to talk about race suicide. And he said the white middle-class American Protestant core is not having enough babies, and those immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe are going to out-reproduce us. Okay, and he's admonishing American women, to have more children to prevent race suicide. So they will not replace us was the battle cry from the Know Nothings. It was the battle cry at the turn of the 20th century, in the 20s, and to this day. So do you think the actual friendship between Irish and Jews was important? Okay, so I'm sorry, Lee. I read the next question because it came up in the chat. But do you want to read it out loud, or should I?
Go ahead.
Okay, so do you think actual friendships between Irish individuals and Jews was an important dynamic? In many ways, yes. And when we look at individual biographies, okay, even though this is obviously much bigger than biography, but people like Leonora O'Reilly and Rose Schneiderman, it wasn't just that O'Reilly was the groomed Schneiderman for leadership in the union movement. They were great friends. They vacationed together. Okay, they were involved with each other's lives. And that was the case with so many of these individuals where we can actually get the biographical details. Jeremiah Mahoney, who the judge who went to bat, to try to get the United States to boycott the Berlin Olympics, he had attended City College. And he said, all my friends at City College were Jews. Okay, I really, they were an important part of my life. Okay, there are partnerships between Jewish and Irish lawyers. Many of the Jewish law students who go to places like Fordham and St. John's go out and enter into create legal law partnerships because neither of them can get into the white shoe Protestant firms. So yeah, even though I think it goes beyond individual friendships, but certainly friendships were there and they occurred randomly and with people whose names we don't know, but certainly all accounts. And in fact, if I can tell one story, and it was an article that came out of one of the Yiddish newspapers, the Yiddish Courier, the Chicago Yiddish newspaper, and a man writes an article about life between him and his Irish neighbors. And so he says, Pat, the father in this family, he said, Pat and I are perfectly pleasant to each other. We meet on the landing on our way to work. We walk as we go down the stairs. We exchange pleasantries. It's not a very deep relationship. And then he says, Pat sometimes says something and then apologizes. Okay, who knows what he said? And the author of this article in the Yiddish paper says, well, you know what? We say bad things about them also. Okay, so I can't fault Pat for saying what he said. He said, but not our wives and children. And he said, the children played together outside on the sidewalk, they are best friends. And he said, and our wives are in and out of each other's apartments. Okay, so there's somebody, he's not famous. He actually wrote with a pen name. We don't know who these people were, but that's how he characterized everyday life in an apartment building in Chicago. Okay, and I can't say anything about Pope John Paul II, but I think that these relationships were key, and they were key in an informal way, like that man who talked about life in that apartment building in Chicago, but became profoundly important and transformative when we look at the Jews and Irish who met each other in the political world, in the labor world, in the world of communal politics, and they really made a difference.
Did the Irish help the Italians like they helped the Jews?
And not less, they had much more conflict because they had conflict in the church. The Jews didn't care what happened in Catholic churches. Okay, whereas the Italians would come into a neighborhood and they would then go into, the parish was dominated by the Irish priests and the Irish hierarchy, and the Irish Catholic leaders of the church, were pretty what word am I going to be searching for? They were really harsh to the Italians. You cannot have an Italian priest who will speak, to whom you can go at confession. You cannot have the festivals and your saints in our church. It's our church. You have to conform to us. So the Italians hate the Irish for exactly that kind of arrogance that they perceived in the church. Well, obviously the Jews didn't care what happened at St. Catherine's Parish or St. Patrick's Parish or the Parish of the Blessed Sacrament. It wasn't of no importance to them. And the Irish have no interest in what goes on within Judaism. So that wall between that religious wall was actually very productive, whereas between Irish and Italian, the shared religious sphere was a zone of tremendous conflict.
Richard, I know that you're there. I can't quite make out your second question, or maybe it's the third one.
Okay, well, I don't know how to answer that because I really don't know. Again, were they important? I think they were important, but again, it was a much more grassroots mass experience with these individuals whose lives we know, um, certainly having experienced friendship across these group lines.
Am I right in assuming that a lot of this research you did was primary spade type research, uncovering
Absolutely.
things, or you didn't find a lot of primary research already there to draw on?
Very
As,
little to draw on, but some of the primary research came from what we might consider published sources, memoirs, autobiographies, and the like. But yeah, the records of these school of the Catholic colleges and universities, the proceedings of various labor movements, Johnny Ahern's day book with all the letters from the Jewish constituents. So it was, if I had spent another 20 years working on this, I would have found even more. But I felt I just kept seeing the same story over and over again of the way in which Irish Americans found it useful to be to open doors for Jews, and the degree to which Jews needed doors opened for them. They could not do it on their own.
yeah, this was a story that hasn't been told, and I think arrests everybody. What? Wait,
I
never heard
hope
of
so.
that.
I hope so.
It was all out there to be put together, but you needed to take the various strands and weave them together.
Yes, and you needed to say, everybody said anti-Semitism this, anti-Semitism that. They were hostile, they were mean. And I said, well, let's see if that was the case. If everybody has said it, then I think it's often, as an academic, as a scholar, that seems to me always the place to stop and say, let's investigate if what is common knowledge is really true, if it's really accurate.
I see Richard has clarified a bit. I was trying to suggest that friendships are very, very important in establishing the kinds of positive dynamics that you've described for us.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And again, as I said, from the autobiographies, the memoirs, the biographical details we have of so many of these people, many of whom, most of whom I could not talk about in this talk, this same story surfaces of sometimes relationships forged in childhood, on the city street, relationships formed in professional schools, relationships formed in work settings. And Richard, I do want to say it's often overlooked in immigration histories. Yes, because most immigration historians will study a group. They'll study the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, and they don't look outward. And I've always described the fields as silos, and they're self-contained, and it's the only time other people show up in these histories is when they're enemies or antagonists, and not on the again, from the bottom up, day-to-day interactions, all the way up to the alliances, which are fundamental in a democratic society.
Yes. Further questions or comments? Otherwise, we'll move toward closing. I want to thank you very much
It was my
for
pleasure. It was my pleasure,
the
and I think
enlightening news on the docket.
thank you. And I really thank Jewish Book Council and you for inviting me here.
I want to draw everybody's attention to the next Taubman Symposium, which is on March the 9th. It will be by Israeli journalist and author Yair Ettinger on his book, Frayed, The Disputes Unraveling Religious Zionists, something that's a hot and very important topic today in Israel, the religious Zionists. So that's on March 9th. That particular webinar will be at 11 o'clock in the morning because Yair is in Israel. It will be 9 o'clock at night for him. So I set it at 11 o'clock for us. He's 10 hours later. If I sit any later for us, it'll be in the middle of the night for him. So this is going to be at 11 o'clock. I will distribute a flyer. The time will be announced and the characterization of what he's going to talk about. So please watch for that in the next week or so. Yair Ettinger, Israeli journalist and author on Unraveled.
Okay,
Yes?
great. Thank you. Okay.
Did you
So
want to
I'm
say
going to
something?
leave now. I know I'm going to leave now. So thank you for your time.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
All right, that wraps it up for us. I'm going to close the recording. Thanks for your attendance today, and consider next time, March 9th. Yair Ettinger.